like a toast.
Para que se despierte. Wake up, wake up.
Can you hear me? I can speak really loudly. Thank you for being here. This is the last day of an amazing festival, and we've had such an incredible time. I've met so many amazing people, learned so many things, and I appreciate your attention on this last day of the festival. We have an exciting session planned, but it's going to go really quickly, so let me just jump right into it. A recent article that I read said that we are shedding data like skin cells. Every time we interact with technology or walk past a device, even sometimes lingering on a web page and doing nothing, we are shedding data. This is part of vast amounts of data that lie in the hands of the private sector. And there has been so much conversation and excitement around the idea of using this data, accessing this privately held data to solve some of the biggest challenges we face. The data that we provide to companies contains incredible detail about our lives, our identities, our environments. How can we make sure that that data is being used and reused in a way that benefits people and managed with accountability and participation? So that brings me to our session today. We are going to kick off this morning by hearing briefly from someone who will tell us about a recent really exciting statement released by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean on data sharing between the public and the private sector. From there, we'll go straight into our debate. We have 4 panelists and 2 debate questions. This entire session is meant to be interactive. So I will be asking you to give us input online and to also, at some point, ask questions or challenge our debaters during the open comment session. You can ask questions or add your input online in either English or Spanish. And with that, let me pass it to Rolando Ocampo, who is joining us from ECLAC to talk about the statement on public-private data sharing. Thank you. Yes.
Hola.
Well, hello, good morning. What we would like to present from the Statistics Division is an agreement that all statisticians in Latin America and the Caribbean that came together in the Statistics Conference of the Americas held a couple months ago in Santiago de Chile arrived at this agreement. This is an agreement on the use of private data and the statement on the use of data held by the private sector for statistical purposes. This declaration, which was signed in the framework of the 12th Statistics Conference, comes also from the Conference of the European Statisticians, who in June 2022, last year, their countries signed an agreement along the same lines. In a meeting we had here in Uruguay, in Montevideo, on a high-level conference on effective exchange of public-private data, arose from several statistical offices, and we had this idea of how to implement it, and statisticians in the Mercosur adopted this first initiative. What is in this initiative that was then expanded to all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean? It's a 13-issue statement asking countries, this is the transcription in English, it invites all countries and statistical offices in their coordination of the private sector data in order to produce official statistics. That is the objective we have. It encourages international agencies to coordinate strategically their work in order to achieve better efficiency. In this particular case, as General Secretariat from ECLAC of the Americas Statistical Conference, we shall have to implement the measures for this type of use.
Colaborar.
So we offer also to collaborate with data suppliers of the private sector to ensure reciprocal benefits and keep up confidentiality, to explore tools to have access to the data in the hands of the private sector exclusively for statistical purposes, keeping all the fundamental principles of statistics regarding data confidentiality. It urges to prepare protocols and infrastructure availability to facilitate data access to the private sector. And it recommends keeping up with good practices. Can we look at the next transparency slide, please? Number 7, from 7 to 13. It urges is that they are doing manually from the console. It urges data collection to be based on the principle of need for specific purposes and to serve the best purposes of citizens. This is an example of what happened during the pandemics. Our statistics office had access to private data of phone companies to make georeferencing work of the citizens when there were lockdowns imposed in the different countries. It urges open communication among public suppliers and availability of statistics. It agrees on improving institutional capacity through capacity building. It agrees on defining and sharing protocols of good practices. It recognizes the importance of sharing data within the work of the Conference of the Americas and also the efficient communication at international, regional, and national levels. These are the 13 items that were agreed on by the countries within the framework of the Conference of Statistics of the Americas. Now, it is in our hands to implement all these exercises to approach as Latin America and the Caribbean, the private sector, in order to coordinate all these matters. There are efforts made within the UN system, wherever there are this type of associations. The group of geospatial information, gathering all geographical bureaus in the world, meets once a year in the first week of August in New York. This is a very new group. It's just 12 years since its creation. And it's been able to include an academic network, but also a private sector network. Communication between geographical bureaus and the private sector group is very fluent. Everyone has its own purposes, sales strategies for the private sector, but also as socially responsible companies. They may also contribute to the countries in order to produce specific tools to follow up some issues that are important for countries, particularly when there are disasters due to natural causes. The same thing applied during the pandemic, when all the geospatial infrastructure was made available so that they could work together with the statistics bureaus. That is, we'll have to look for some elements and arrangements that will have to find out, and regional international organizations that include all software developers or the large companies represented in Latin America, like Amazon and Google and Facebook and so on, in order to be able to work together to benefit countries, but also industrial chambers. There we could start approaching them. So there is room here for Q&A now and to discuss these matters, but we are on our way to be able to include these initiatives. Thank you.
In English, quickly, let me just say that questions for a few minutes. If anyone wants to ask or comment anything about this statement or declaration, we'll take a few minutes.
Gracias, Rolando, por tu exposición. Creo que
Thank you, Rolando. I think that you've touched upon a fundamental issue, particularly coming from the Statistics Bureau of Ecuador. We can't be isolated from the private sector. On the contrary, we must take everyone up on board to join efforts because they are doing things very well, and so we can share with the private sector very many methodologies, and that relation can be very beneficial for countries if the private sector is included in all the discussions of the Statistical Bureau and the civil society. So together, we can make this data revolution help us to comply with the SDGs. But we have to bring them up on board, and we have to see how beneficial that relationship can be for them to hand in their data, and also for us to provide quality data. We're specialists on data, and that could be a very beneficial relationship. It's a very good step forward to have this resolution from the Conference of Statistics of the Americas, so that's good. Thank you. Thank you. And let me take advantage of this particular issue. The private sector may assist in a very important manner for the decision-making process of public policies. Statistics bureaus are in charge of population census, household surveys, and all those things include questions about water, sewage, energy, number of rooms in the house, number of vehicles. And there are other surveys that involve the origin and destination, and there, for instance, the use of tags in vehicles or the use of georeferencing of any movements may contribute with very important elements for the building of public policies, how cities grow, all that kind of thing that aren't competing really with the private sector, but that there are elements that can allow us to use these type of tools. Thank you. Thank you, Orlando. Thank you for your insight, for sharing your views with us.
Huge step. As our colleague from Ecuador mentioned, it's rising public pressure, but we're talking about accessing data that's held by the private sector, so companies are a vital part of this discussion. We're going to launch the debate in 1 second, but before we do, I want to ask for your help with something and tell you a little bit about, very briefly, about a project that we took on at the Global Partnership. what is this? It looks like a cookbook. And it is. About a year ago, the Global Partnership with Support from Google.org set out to answer some fundamental questions around data sharing. Essentially, we know that most data partnerships do not persist or succeed in the long run. So the question we wanted to answer was, what does it take? What are the key factors that enable effective, ethical, and sustained or sustainable data sharing? And we packaged this as a handy little toolkit that looks like a cookbook. After a year of conversation with experts and practitioners in our network, what we found was that these factors showed up over and over again as being characteristics of successful data sharing partnerships across sectors. So of course, at the bottom you see carbohydrates. We all love bread, or at least I love bread. Mechanisms for building and sustaining trust are an essential element. But as are shared value and benefits, that all partners who are sharing data see some kind of benefit from that, and that the benefits are shared with people as well. Dependable data and infrastructure are essential, just like proteins in a healthy diet. You can't grow stronger or stay healthy without proteins, just like you can't share data if you don't have good data and infrastructure. It won't be effective, ethical, or sustained. Capacity building, ongoing support for skills and knowledge training for the people who are handling the data and making decisions about the data. And last but not least, healthy fats, butter, oil, for flexibility, adaptability as times are changing. We know that we're witnessing a change in the world in terms of this topic. We see more and more conversations and pressure towards sharing data across sectors, but these conversations raise really tricky questions, as you all know. One of the things that we want to get out of today is to source a little bit of your perspectives about what these questions are and what are some of the things you have learned in your work or some of the resources that have been helpful to you when it comes to sharing data. So I will put this QR code up here a couple times today. And my request to you is that throughout this session, you reflect on your work as you're listening to these debates and engaging in these debates, and share with us any thoughts or ideas that you have. Your thoughts and comments will be used to shape the next iteration of the cookbook. We know this is a quickly evolving field, and we plan to continue adding to the cookbook in the future. So thank you in advance for that. I also want to say that our debaters will discuss questions, and then we will open this up to you in the audience. So please also keep in mind that you're allowed to take a stance on this and share your comments or questions with our panelists. Does that sound okay? In English and in Spanish, of course. All right, so please join me in welcoming to the stage our four panelists. Welcome Deepa from Athena Infonomics, Maurice from the University of West Indies, Lachlan from Statistics Botswana, and Josh from Development Gateway. Thank you very much. The way this debate will work today, our panelists will each have 5 minutes to present their initial points on a question. They will then have 2 minutes to respond to each other, and then we will open up the floor to take questions, comments, and challenges from the audience. Please share your ideas or your thoughts. This is meant to be an interactive, fun, participatory, and engaging debate. At the end, each panelist will have a few minutes to give their final statements, and then we will move on to our next round of debaters. How does that sound? Okay, well, let's get started. Maurice and Deepa, many of the questions around public-private data sharing regard the terms of access. Should governments be able to access privately held data for free, for example, in an emergency? Rolando mentioned that during the COVID-19 pandemic, statistics departments were able to use mobility data for pandemic response. That seems really important, right? But then there are always going to be transaction costs when it comes to sharing data. right? It costs money to process data, to make it interoperable, to answer questions with data, to analyze it, to store it, to turn it into usable statistics or reports. And so my question to you both is, under what terms should governments be able to access privately held data, and should they be able to access it for free? And Athena, I will pass it to you first to argue for.
Thanks a ton, Janet. So I told Morris I have two advantages when it comes to debating. I'm really loud, and I'm very animated. So if I don't have substance, I'm going to use both of those to my benefit, Morris, in this debate. So it's lovely to be here with you all. The fact that you all turned up at the Data Festival means we don't have to talk about the need for data sharing. We're all aligned. We all want data to be shared. And we certainly want data to be shared for good use. And the government is the only mandated organization to deliver welfare. I'm here to argue that data should be made available not only for free, but should be mandatory. And it shouldn't be one-off. It's not just in crisis. It's something that we will need to be able to sustain on an ongoing basis. And this is not new, right? History is full of public sector finding ways to reorganize the norms, rules, laws, to get private actors, whether it's individuals or private sector organizations, to behave in ways that's consistent with public welfare. So that happens everywhere. It happens in the way we think about how we pick up and manage garbage. You see it in the way we organize transport. Why should data be any different? And the reason I argue for it to be both free and mandatory in sustained is because I think that's the only way it can really be put to good use. It's not the one-off, it's not the crisis partnerships, but it's really the ability to come together and partner and think about the use of private sector data for public welfare that matters. Now, I'm going to unpack the word free, Morris, here a little bit, right? I don't think we should price data as an asset independently. But in every single context, irrespective of whether it's data or infrastructure or a basic service, the norms that govern the interaction between the public and the private sector, there are three things. There's policy, there's predictability, there's public infrastructure, right? You need those three things for any form of a partnership between the public and the private sector to work. And we need that for data, right? So you don't have to price the data, because also, whose data is it anyway? Twitter's data is not Twitter's data, it's mine, it's yours. Facebook's data is not Facebook's data, it's our data. If anybody should get money, we should get money from the data, right? It shouldn't be the private sector at all. Why would the private sector get paid for data that doesn't belong to them in the first place? On the contrary, private sector should put that data to use for public value, and governments should, and we need to create the environment that enables governments to harness it for things that are meaningful, that are more meaningful than designing advertisements to sell us more mugs or coffee or whatever it is that the private sector does with this data. But I go back. Free, mandatory, sustained, not different from the way governments have interacted with the private sector historically across contexts. And I think the same norms and rules apply just as much for data as it applies for the other sectors. Government just needs to do three things. And these don't have to be linked to pricing of data. They have to build the public infrastructure so that the private sector can contribute. And there are very good examples of platforms that enable this. They need to create a policy environment that facilitates how this data is going to, or clarifies how the data is going to be used. Data privacy is compliant with the obligations that the private sector is obligated to in terms of personal or use of personally identifiable information and GDPR and some of those compliances. And you need predictability. You need a government that doesn't keep changing its mind about what they want from the private sector and how they want to do it. And as someone who's in the private sector, I'm constantly doing stuff for the government that I don't want to do, that doesn't serve my self-interest, but I do it because the government wants me to do it, and the government uses it for delivering things that are larger than my private interest. Morris.
Thank you so much. Excellent points, Deepa. Maurice, I believe you're going to argue against this.
I am, and excellent points, Deepa. Incidentally, it has been a pleasure to meet you.
Yes,
so
it's lovely to meet you too.
I apologize beforehand that I'm going to reject everything that you've just said. listen, I learned quite early in my flirtations with the open source community that English is a very limiting language. And we use free as a kind of placeholder for many meanings.
Right.
You know, we use free. In fact, the French are much more elegant. The French have gratis, which for us in English is free, as in freeness. And they have libre, which is freedom of expression, freedom of the ability to access, freedom to innovate and to use. And I think, for me, access to privately held data should not be free in the sense of gratis. I think that freeness, and in the Caribbean, the term we use for gratis is freeness. In Jamaica, they say anything free, no good, right? So freeness creates a kind of a mentality, a kind of sense of entitlement. It actually tends to devalue a resource when you just characterize it as free. It makes the consumer lazy. They lack the commitment to do what is required to build the institutional mechanisms to manage public-private partnership models, to build the capacity to exploit the value of that asset. I think free creates the wrong kind of tenor. It creates the wrong kind of sense of obligation on the part of the public sector. So for me, free, as in gratis, is the absolutely wrong way to characterize public-private partnerships.
What's the obligation
access.
on the private?
You can't comment until I'm finished. But you know, there's no question, and you said it very well, that there's enormous value in access to privately held data in the Caribbean. Telecoms data, electricity consumption, retail data that can provide models to help tackle some of the biggest challenges that we have in the region. Challenges around climate change, climate adaptation, disaster preparedness. So there's absolutely no question, and there's no debate about the fact that we have to find ways to provide access to that kind of data. But you know, in research that we've done in the Caribbean, and my colleague is in here somewhere, we've done surveys of the business community in Jamaica, in Trinidad and Tobago, and we've always asked the question, would you share your data? And there's generally been a willingness to do so, but there's always a caveat. What are you going to do with it? What is in it for me? How do I ensure that it doesn't become a competitive threat? Right? So I think that when we speak about public-private partnerships and sharing data, there has to be a kind of a compact. And so that not free, not gratis, but there has to be a kind of social equity that governments have to provide in this compact. That social equity has to involve building the capacity to protect that data. It has to be an investment in the kind of institutional mechanisms that make these public-private partnerships build on a foundation of trust and long-term sustainability. So it's not free at all. We're not necessarily talking about a monetary equity, but a kind of social and political equity in that collaboration. And they have to pay that. They have to invest in that if these collaborations are going to be successful in the long run. So not gratis. Deepa.
So you're agreeing?
Definitely not gratis.
So, okay, I think what's interesting is we're probably saying the same thing. We're saying that we don't need a price. We don't need a price tag on the data. We're saying, the one thing that what I'm saying that's a little different, Maurice, is I don't think public policy can always just work around the what's in it for you. Incentives are important. There are situations where private actors will have to act. Why do we have corporate social responsibility? Why do we have emissions disclosures? These cost money. The SB 253 that was passed in California, that all of this 21 other states in the United States, is going to substantially increase the cost of disclosures on emission norms. No private sector wants to do it. What's in it for them? Not much. But it's an important public good. So I think we really need to elevate this debate beyond the what's in it for me to the what, at what point does a transaction break? When the private burden of compliance and obligation far exceeds the public good and value, and they're not able to make that marriage, it breaks down. But the data itself should be free.
That cannot happen in a costless transaction.
And it's not a costless. Yeah.
Let me just interrupt you for 1 second, and because we're going to come back to this. Just 1 second. Something I should have said when we started this debate is that each of our debaters have kindly agreed to a position that was set beforehand. just so you know. So Deepa and Maurice, I don't want to give away, your true feelings about it, but I can't guarantee that they're actually arguing for the point that they personally believe. I want to pose a question to you, and I'm going to give you both a chance to respond. If companies can sell their data to other companies, for example, for targeted ads, and make revenue on that, then why would they give that data away to the public sector, even under the conditions that we are talking about here, some kind of corporate responsibility or social or environmental benefit? Why would they give that data away for free and bear the cost of turning that data into something usable by the public sector?
So I think that the minute, and this is this classic public goods problem, Jan, what you're raising is a governance question. It's a public goods question that we've struggled with, right? Why should I segregate my garbage, right? It goes back to actions that we will never take because it doesn't benefit us directly, and which is why I think public policy, which is why regulation becomes important. But the way you set it up is designed to incentivize and support, which means the transaction cost of doing it for the private sector should not be so high that they simply will just opt out, or there is just going to be substantial lobbying against it because it significantly erodes their competitive advantage, or sort of just erodes their business, it erodes their business potential in the marketplace. So, and I think discovering the level and type of investments in public infrastructure, discovering the role that policy and regulation can play in creating that sort of an environment where the private sector is obligated to do certain things that go beyond their self-interest. Because, yes, if the private sector will never be incentivized to give away anything. And if it's optional, they will always opt out. And this is true for individuals, it's true for the private sector. So if we believe that the public sector has the opportunity to do good, we need to find ways through policy and regulation and through public infrastructure investments to enable that transition and enable and shift actions of the private sector to comply with that public good, because I don't see this working in any sort of a voluntary format. And it's the same with voluntary SDG disclosure norms. It's true, take anything that's voluntary, it's not sustainable. So I do believe firmly that when it's public good, you're shaping private actions to be consistent with what is relevant publicly, and that happens through regulation and investments in public infrastructure.
Thank you. Maurice?
Well, to answer your question quite simply, Janet, I think that the kinds of compacts that we have to define that govern those data exchanges have to also identify the acceptable use. And while a company may earn, from a private exchange with other entities, the use of data in these sort of larger public-private arrangements are solving big issues that impact everyone, whether it is crime, whether it is disaster preparedness, and they benefit from that. So again, it comes back to the kind of non-free equity that has to define these models of exchange, which says, okay, you're providing me with electricity consumption data. We're going to be using that as proxies for household poverty, or we're going to be using it to understand other aspects of our larger statistical indicators. And so they understand that they are a beneficiary of the use of that data. And those compacts have to be well defined and not gratis.
I agree. And it's not money, it's social equity. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you both. Okay, we'll open it up to the audience now. Does anyone have a question, a comment, or would you like to take a side?
Anyone from the private sector would hate this regulation if it came out, obligating you to share your metadata of a certain kind, structure. Start with the big companies first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your debate. It's really appreciated. I can sense your passion about the topic. And I know you've just mentioned, are there private sector people in the room? And I have more of an ask of you both, and that is, what is your pitch to the private sector on this? Like, imagine you have private sector, like all of us are in the private sector. What would each of you say to them right now? Like, what would that pitch be? And that's my question to you both.
We've created
Can I ask you both to answer this from your positions? So your pitch for offering it for free and not for free?
Okay. Josh and I were joking about autocracies and what I would do if I ran government. But and this goes back to my premise. It's provocative and it's controversial. I'm government. I don't have to pitch to you. I tell you what to do. I set the laws. I design a rubric. I make the transaction cost of engaging with government reasonable. And I talk to you about what that looks like, but you comply because I'm government and you're the private sector and I'm sovereign. And when you are operating in my country, I want you, because I believe that you will never be incentivized enough to act outside your self-interest as private sector. And if I need to put something that belongs to you to good use for the public context, I need regulation, and I will mandate that as long as I create the infrastructure and the transaction cost of doing it is reasonable. We did that with digital public infrastructure. We have 90 billion transactions, right? Digital financial transactions in India today. We didn't do that by asking Paytm and Google Pay and we didn't ask these guys what they wanted. We said, this is the infrastructure we're creating. You play by our rules.
Okay. Well, contrary to Deepa's antagonistic pitch, mine would be very much one from a position of quid pro quo. There has to be a value proposition for the private sector entity. Because the question we always hear is, well, what's in it for me? And the truth is, when we talk to the private sector in the Caribbean, sometimes we make the mistake of characterizing the private sector as this homogeneous big tech. Private sector in the Caribbean ranges from large enterprises to medium-sized companies to small entrepreneurs, and they all have ways in which they can contribute to the larger data ecosystem. And sometimes we find that a pitch that says, okay, you know what, you have all this data and you're not getting returns on your data because you don't have the internal capacity. And so sometimes that pitch could involve, well, we're organizing these capacity building workshops, or we're building data scientists, and we can help you to do that. Can we have access to your data as part of that exchange of value, right? So I think that there always has to be, and my colleague from our National Statistics Office is here, we always talk about this quid pro quo. Whether we're talking to the public sector or the private sector, because we're academia. And incidentally, I believe academia has a very important role to play as a broker in these kinds of exchanges.
I totally agree. I agree.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Please.
Hi. Is this hello? Hello?
Sorry. So to what extent do the privacy guarantees implicit in taking private sector data and using them for the public good? To what extent do privacy guarantees play an important role in this? And by that I mean the need to use these data for statistical purposes that serve the public interest rather than the interests of government, essentially in the past, of identifying undesirable individuals and the potential for misuse, really, if you want to be honest about it. My second question is, do private sector entities have the ability to take hidden action that minimizes the use to the government of the data you're trying to collect if you pursue an adversarial framework? Thank you.
Okay, the first one's easy, and probably Maurice, we both probably agree on that, right? I think even in terms of real public-private data sharing transactions, they have to be compliant with data regulation on personally identifiable information to begin with, which means companies have blatantly said no, even in situations of crisis, to share information. And I think the public sector actually cannot, again, depending on which country, I think it's incredibly important. I think individual privacy is incredibly important. When I talk about policy, I think there's been a lot of discussion around the role and the value of data stewards, because the public sector sometimes doesn't have the capacity, the staffing norms, the resources to be able to negotiate and engage with the private sector well and do it in a way where they're fully compliant with the privacy norms. So I fully agree on the role and the value of protecting individual privacy and there is no, and thinking through except like if it's because the only instance where that's been discussed as a potential gray is a terrorist attack, right? Like literally, there have been situations where you're like, oh, I need this information because we need, where airlines have had to disclose very specific personal data, and now we can start talking use cases. But 99%, 99.999%, I think I'm fully aligned on the need to protect data privacy, the role of a data steward, ideally on the government side, that can play a role on the fiduciary and on the compliance side is super important. The second question really was around, if you could remind me, what is the private sector gaming the system? Yeah. So I think if you look at the beauty of large volumes of data, and I think this is a really important question, because the government today does not have capacity at all, right, to use this information as is, right? I don't think there are staffing norms. I don't think we have infrastructure in place, which is why there's a lot of discussion around the role of data stewards. But a process like that will figure itself out over time, because if you have smart data scientists, if you have data engineers and data scientists on the government side looking at longitudinal data sets coming from the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Airbnbs, there are ways to pick up on the gaming bits, right? Like based on patterns that you see. And data scientists will have to figure that out over time, because there are various ways. And then it goes back to what's the cost of gaming the data set versus what the benefit is of hiding that data for an Airbnb or a private sector company vis-a-vis sharing information in formats that's relevant for government. So these things will sort itself out just based on transaction costs over time. And I think it'll boil down to capacity in the government to be able to look at this over time and think about ways in which they can avoid gaming. But in general, if you've created the infrastructure and you're starting to share data, and there is some social equity, so we should collaborate. I'd be the adversarial autocrat, and you'd be the wonderful, pleasant, academic collaborator that would build social equity and bring everybody along. But that's my 2 cents on the gaming piece.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let me pause you there, because we're going to need to move on to the next question. So before we end this section, I just want to give it to you, Maurice, for a couple minutes to sum up your perspective and where you stand on this according to the debate, and then I'll pass it back to Deepa for one closing thought.
Yeah. In summary, it's quite simple. This is not a gratis exchange. It is a compact, right, that has transaction costs. It needs investment in social and political equity for it to be effective. I actually think that the ECLAC declaration that we saw earlier is an excellent framework and an excellent start in terms of defining some of the elements of that compact. I think the issue of free is a very sort of delusional term, and I think it leads us down the wrong path. So we should avoid it at all costs. The second thing I would say is that the quid pro quo is implicit in all of these exchanges, and it has to be a deliberate part of the conversation. And the third thing, listen, the private sector needs as much help as they can contribute to the larger data ecosystem. And if you can find brokers like multilaterals or academia that can facilitate that mutual exchange of value, then that's what makes these collaborations sustainable in the long run.
Thank you. Thank you for those very thoughtful comments based on your excellent research. Deepa, let me pass it to you.
There is a thoughtfulness to the process that the government needs to engage in, so that the public infrastructure, the policy, the data stewardship, the predictability exists. So this is not free necessarily for the government entirely. There is an uptime, there are investments to be made to, like in any marriage, like in any transaction, but the data itself should be made available without a price tag on it, and should be made available, and the ecosystem that you create early on should enable and support that, because when it's one-off and when it's voluntary, it'll never happen, and it's never really put to good use.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'll ask our next panelist to come to the table. Don't forget, we're asking you to also contribute online. If you have thoughts and you don't want to stand up and speak on the microphone, totally understand that. Please contribute to our survey in English or in Spanish. Our next question is around the factors that enable data sharing. Earlier I spoke about the research we did on finding out what factors enable effective, ethical, and sustained data sharing. Trust was on that pyramid, but it's not the only thing. We find that there is much more emphasis placed on the technical skills and the technical problems that come along with data sharing. And so my question to the panelists today is whether or not trust is the single most important factor, and why or why not. So I will first pass it to Podlako, who will be arguing for.
Thank you, Janet. I think and I believe all of us in this room, maybe with the exception of Josh, believe trust is the single most important factor in public-private data sharing. But if that is not the case, I'll try in the 4.5 minutes to convince you otherwise, Josh. Access to private data by public entities is crucial, like the previous debaters were saying. Government needs to access that data freely. Trust is central to this partnership or this sharing of data. Firstly, I want to demonstrate that we need a robust legal environment for compliance in terms of sharing this data. You'll find that either the public entity or the private company or entity have their own private or privacy conditions and policy. But when both entities are not guided by a central legal environment or policy, there's a chance that trust may not be achieved when there's no guiding legal environment or policy in terms of sharing that data. That's why it's very important that there is a data protection law that will govern both parties in terms of sharing that data, so that they can be trust in the sharing of that data. The other factor that needs to be looked at in terms of sharing data is all about transparency in terms of sharing data. The provider of the data or the subject of the data should know why that data is being collected, how is it going to be used, and how it's going to benefit everybody at the end of the day. So there has to be clear communication on the purpose and the methods and the scope of the data that is going to be shared. I'll give an example. If you look at the data that comes from the mobile telecommunications or mobile data, it's a huge set of variables that can be collected from that data. So there has to be clear, what is the point that I want to make? Data minimization. All that data should not be shared. It has to be concentration on the very important variables. For example, in mobile data, there's names, there are IDs, there are other variables. But as a public entity, do you really need that information to be shared? So you need to minimize the amount of data that, and specifically concentrate on the data that is required. In that way, you are giving confidence that the information is shared for the right purposes, and also are minimizing the risk involved in sharing that data. There's also the issue of collaboration and partnerships to improve trust. The private entities and the private entity need to collaborate more. They need to have strong collaborative engagement so that it can build trust when that data is finally being shared. The other point relates to privacy and security. There has to be strong security and privacy interventions. In terms of securing that data, we have to have strong, robust algorithms or firewalls when that data is shared. In that sense, you create trust that the confidentiality and the privacy of that data is maintained. Because if a private entity shares that data and these factors are not ensured, it can be legal, financial, or even reputational damage that can occur from the breaches that may occur if those factors are not taken into consideration when the data is being shared. Stop here for now.
Thank you, Padlaka.
Yep.
Padlakas, your experience in this is very evident here.
Yeah.
I think this will be a tough question, but I will pass it to Josh to argue against.
Thank you. So I want to correct one thing right off the bat, which is that I'm not the only person in the room who feels this way. Our dear leader, Deepa, absolutely feels the same as I do. But it was interesting when I was assigned this position because earlier this week I published a blog on how can increasing trust help to deliver the 2030 agenda. So my job here isn't just to debate against Butlako, but also I need to convince each of you in this room that I don't know what I'm talking about. And that should be a bit easier, I think. I think Maurice touched on a lot of this. You know, trust is, I'm not going to argue that trust is not important, but I'm going to argue that it's not nearly the most important piece. When you're a private sector actor, absent being fully compelled to do something, you're looking at everything through a lens of cost-benefit, and you're looking at also risk mitigation. And so then the question is, how do you ensure that the value that could be realized from sharing data exceeds the costs and exceeds the risks? And so that value is, I think, the single most important thing. I'll give an example from our work in Nigeria. We've been working supporting the Ministry of Agriculture on strengthening their data in the fertilizer sector, understanding how much is being imported, how much is being produced domestically, where is it being sold, what are the retail prices, is it reaching markets at the right time. But the problem is in Nigeria, the fertilizer sector is heavily privatized. And the government not only doesn't implement, but also doesn't have the data necessary to be able to track that, to understand how it can do targeted subsidies or influence its public policy. And so the private sector in Nigeria, I wouldn't say that they necessarily trust the government. I will say that they certainly don't trust each other. And so we are entering into a low, or I won't say no trust, but a low trust environment. And so then how do you operate? And so the first thing that we did is we brought about 12 different of the largest producers in the country, brought them around the table, and we talked about what value could they generate by having access to an aggregated set of information. Each of them have their own piece of the puzzle. They have information that's proprietary. What is the actual incentive to bring that together? And then we also talked about what would we need to do to mitigate the risks so that you would feel comfortable gathering that data. From there, our next step was to develop non-disclosure agreements. We went to each of these groups individually to make sure that they agreed with the terms, but we also had to reassure them that each of their competitors were agreeing to the exact same terms. No exceptions, no carve-outs. Again, no trust. It was all legal. It all had to be negotiated out. And then developed a very clear data governance and data management protocol. How will the data be gathered? Where will it be stored? Who will have access to the raw data? How will we anonymize so you don't know which data are coming from which competitor? Where will it be shared? What will be the license terms? All of these things, again, not trust-based, procedural-based, process-based. And now, fast forward a couple of years, the private sector have continued to sustain this. And not only have they sustained the actual sharing of the data, as the grant funding that initially started the program started to dissipate, they've actually stepped in to fund this. So they value it enough that they're not only willing to share their information and comply, they're actually willing to fund the process of aggregating it. And they've started to collaborate to say, oh, there are some market gaps. There's some data gaps on how much fertilizer is being used for different crops, what types of blends are needed, and actually coming together to pay for that with the expectation that their competitors will have the data, that the government will have the data, and that the public will have some version of the data as well. So I think that as you go through good process, as you go through collaborative process, as you develop kind of clear and credible and enforceable data governance mechanisms, and then are seen to be acting on those, and then as you actually demonstrate the value generated, that you can create a cultural shift from individualistic opacity toward collective transparency and data sharing. But it really does all start with that question of why? What is the value that we can generate by doing this? What can we achieve both for public benefit and for our own?
Thank you, Josh. That's compelling. Kind of proxy measures for trust that can achieve the same ends. Podlako, I will pass it back to you briefly if you would like to respond.
Yep. Just talk about bringing the example that he gave of the Nigerian private companies coming together and agreeing on the protocols and everything else. That in a way is enhancing or ensuring trust when there's something that everybody can agree on or everybody is comfortable that these are the protocols that will be followed by everybody. That's enhancing trust. So trust always is at the center of all the collaborations that end up making sure that data is being shared. That's my point.
Josh?
I think the key here is that trust is an outcome of good process. It's not a foundation of creating good process. And so you can operate without trust, at least to begin. Now, maybe for sustaining over time, you have to demonstrate that you're credible, that you're following, doing what you said that you would, that the value that you promise is actually being generated. But if we're talking about what is the most important piece, what is the piece that lets you get started? It's not trust, it's the promise of generating value in a way that matters to these private sector actors.
Thank you so much. I think this is a really tricky question because it's hard to imagine trying to get two partners to share data with lower levels of trust than governments and private companies when it comes to the terms that data will be shared under and how it will be used, guarded, shared beyond that, et cetera. So thank you so much. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. If you are in the audience and you would like to contribute, please step forward.
Hi. I was thinking, isn't the first step that data is like checked, real, that data is actually its veracity? I mean, because before trust, we should ensure that the data that is being shared is actually real. I don't know if I'm clear with that.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so the audience member, thank you for your comment. It's kind of the question is like, okay, well, does trust even matter if you don't have data that is of good quality, right? In all the meanings of quality. Podlako.
It's a tricky one. Yeah, of course, data needs to, the quality of the data needs to be ensured. But how do you build trust? First, you need to make sure that everybody is at the same level in terms of the classifications, the standards that need to be followed before that data is being collected or even been shared. In that way, you build trust. But trust is incremental. First, we can have the data, and because of the trust, we can all work together to ensure that you build trust, or you improve the quality of that data by sharing and seeing where it lacks. Then, because of the trust that we have together, we can build on improving that quality of the data going forward. So trust is central to data sharing.
So you can always improve data, but you can't necessarily just improve trust at the drop of a hat. Okay, Josh.
Yeah, I think this comes back also to the question from the last debate in terms of gaming the system. And I think in the case of when you have private sector to private sector, there are obviously very clear incentives to validate information and to verify it. In the case of public sector, it is more of a responsibility than on the government to be able to do it. But I think it comes down to less so trust and more what is the cost of compliance versus the cost and the risk of non-compliance, including non-compliance through providing falsified data and information. And so I think it's not something that you can take fully on trust. It's something that does require kind of technical validation. And that can build trust over time. But again, I think it starts from the position of how do we verify and validate that the information that's being provided is credible? And then you start to become more of a trusted actor over time.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, it's me again. I just want to say this is a great debate. I do think that one of the most important things to think about in terms of trust is the alternative, the contractual cost of enforcing trust and achieving the same thing through contractual mechanisms. I think that we often underestimate the extent to which private companies can engage in behavior that either sabotages or minimizes the benefit of the data we're trying to collect, either by obfuscating the scope of the information they obtain or using classifications that are irrelevant or arbitrarily adding complexity to the cost of using the data. So without trust, how do you elicit that effort? And I don't really see an alternative to trust, because without it, you really are starting to get into a very complex field of game theory, which, to my knowledge, hasn't been overcome. And also, I just wanted to put a pitch out for the importance of privacy-enhancing technologies, which may play a key role in this. Thank you.
Agreed. A shout out to privacy-enhancing technologies as well, which are an important part of this conversation. Josh, I'll hand this one to you first.
Yeah, I think, again, it comes down to the question of value and a question of collaboration. And some of that does come down to trust. Some of that comes down to, for example, what are the risks of being, found to be non-compliant, whether that's a direct kind of risk of kind of government, action, or whether that's a risk of not having information or access to the other information that's being shared in this case. And I think, everything comes back to, from the individual actor perspective, cost-benefit analysis. I agree, and I do think trust is important, but I think that in the absence of the different the governance, the enforcement mechanisms, that you can't just go forward on trust alone. And so it's just one of the pieces of the puzzle and not the most important one.
Yeah, Potlako, I think this one especially is a good question for you, since you were talking about some of the factors that enable trust.
I think he was agreeing with me that trust is central. In the bigger scheme of things, that's what I was saying in the beginning. You have to start with the right framework, the legal compliance, so that you can build trust. So if you have the laws that protects both parties and the laws that governs everybody, even when the private entity might try to circumvent some of the steps that are needed to collect or to process data, when we have initially have all we have the framework, we have the instruments that govern. In a way, you build trust. It might not be at higher level, but we have ensured that at the minimum level, we can have trust. Even if they were to go out of line, it won't be that of a tangent. It'll still be governed by the rules and the the regulations that are in place.
So not a soft, mushy kind of feeling of trust, but a more practical approach. Yes, last question. I saw a hand.
Sí, hola, buenos días. Isabel Islas.
Isabel Islas from the Statistics Bureau of Mexico. I have, rather than a comment, I've got very many questions in mind, and I'd like to share them with you. I think that in terms of trust, if there was enough trust, perhaps the statistics bureaus, which are institutions that are based practically on trust, to be able to obtain data from citizens, we would have today, or we could have today, all the information from administrative records and the private sector. And the truth is that we haven't. So trust is a necessary but not sufficient issue. That's one thing. The other thing is, how can we think about intermediate access arrangements? That is, making an equivalence with statistics bureaus. We have statistics secrecy. We have access. We give no access to micro data. It's a way of covering and protecting the people who give us information. So how can we approach private sector to tell us, give us your micro data from the outset? Because they could also have a private statistics secrecy saying, I can't give you that as a micro data, but perhaps we can come up with some institutional arrangements in the same way we make tabulated and add-ons and so on, in a similar way, doing that with the private sector in order to move forward to the right direction and then get organized to have access to microdata. I can think of APIs allowing us to have access to statistics bureaus or the private sector, or private information which we used to have in Twitter. And that was a way of getting closer to the information from the private sector in a safe way for statistical purposes. And we could move on and advance in that direction. And last but not least, how can we solve the question we want to have access to the private sector. But the truth is that there is a lot of information from the social sector. There are many organizations in the civil society that have information, and that that information would be very useful and important for our sector. And I haven't seen that statistics bureaus are making any arrangements to have access, regular access to that information that could help us to make decisions. So, well, that's it. It's not a question, but very many ideas. Thank you. Thank you.
Today, I want to give it to each of you to make one final comment and to close us out, and then we will end the session because we have a plenary to get to.
All right.
So Josh, well, actually, Potlaco, let me pass it to you first. Would you like to make a final statement on why trust is the most important factor?
Yes, thank you so much. I still want to reiterate that trust, of course, trust cannot be the only thing, but is one key factor that needs to be ensured in terms of data sharing. The other point that I want to make is that we can have the tools or the protocols of how that data is being protected and its security, but trust also comes in. We know that there are breaches. You can have all the security protocols, but somehow, somewhere, there will be breaches. But when those breaches happen, what do you have in place? Do you have mitigation plans or strategies to ensure that you restore that confidence in that data? So you need to have trust by developing the risk mitigation plans. We also building on the trust that if there is a breach, there's a fallback position of bringing that trust again. So I think trust is very key among other factors. Thank you.
Thank you. Josh.
All right, I'll be brief. I think my final point is that we should hope that trust is not the single most important factor, because we're living in an age that is characterized by low levels of interpersonal trust, social trust, trust in institutions. And so if we're relying on trust and not relying sufficiently on other mechanisms, on governance mechanisms, on technical verification, et cetera, we won't get nearly as far as we need to get here.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed this debate today and that it gave you some food for thought and that you'll share some of your thoughts and reflections on these processes with us by scanning this QR code. I want to thank you for your participation today, for coming to this debate, to supporting this work, and invite you to connect with any of our panelists afterwards. And thank you so much to all four of you for your thoughtful comments and for taking positions that were assigned to you that were not necessarily what you believe. I've gotten so much out of this, and I hope you all have too.